The knife came down before the door finished opening. Jasmine Okonkwo didn't look up. She heard Dalton Reed's footsteps, the particular heavy drag of a man who had already decided how a conversation was going to end before he walked into it, and she kept her blade moving through the shallots because her hands had never once lied to her, and she needed something honest in the room. "Put it down," Dalton said. She put it down, slowly, because she was not afraid of him and she wanted him to know it. "You're done," he said. He was holding a folder the way men hold folders when the folder is a weapon. "Theft from company accounts. HR has the report. Security has the footage. You have 20 minutes to clear your locker." Jasmine turned around. She looked at him, really looked, the way her mother had taught her to look at people who were lying, straight at the left eye, steady and unblinking, and she said, "You and I both know that folder is empty." Dalton smiled. It was the smile of a man who had done this before. "What I know," he said, "is that I have 12 restaurants, a lawyer on a monthly retainer, and a board that has never once questioned my word." "What do you have, Jasmine?" The silence answered for her. She picked up her mother's carbon steel knife, the one thing in the room that was hers, the one thing she had brought from home, the one thing he could not touch, and she slid it into her bag. She walked past him. At the door, she stopped without turning around. "You're going to regret this," she said. "I already forgot your name," Dalton said. She walked out into the rain, and she did not stop walking for 11 blocks, because she knew if she stopped, she would sit down on the pavement, and she could not afford to sit down. Not today. Not with Amara's tuition deadline in 4 weeks, and the landlord already 3 days into a late notice, and the kind of silence on her phone that meant every reference Dalton had touched was already burning. By Friday, every serious kitchen in Silverstone City had her name on a list. By the following Tuesday, she was sitting in a recruitment office watching an agent blink at a job listing that paid 3 times the market rate. She signed it before he finished reading her the terms. This is what happens when a woman with nothing left to lose walks into the most dangerous house in the city. Stay right here. Subscribe right now and share this with someone who needs to see how this ends. Because I promise you, Jasmine Okonkwo is not who anyone in this story expects her to be. Don't move. The drive to the compound took 40 minutes through streets she memorized by feel because the blindfold was amateur and she was not. 3 left turns, a long coastal road that smelled of salt and expensive isolation, a gate that opened before the car slowed, which meant sensors, which meant money so old it had stopped counting itself. When the cloth came off her eyes, she was standing before a structure of black stone and salt-bleached glass on the edge of the ocean, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and it frightened her in the specific way that beautiful, dangerous things are supposed to frighten you. Not enough to run, just enough to pay attention. Mrs. Lim was waiting at the entrance. She was a compact Korean woman in her 60s, with the posture of someone who had spent decades absorbing the shock of powerful men, and had decided that the correct response was to become harder than the shock. She walked Jasmine through the compound in silence, room by room, floor by floor, and the kitchen alone was larger than the apartment Jasmine shared with Amara, and 2 years of accumulated survival. 6 burner range, French copper pots, a cold room that was better stocked than any restaurant Jasmine had worked in. She ran her hand along the edge of the marble counter and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, something that was almost calm. "The rules," Mrs. Lim said, stopping at the kitchen door. Her voice had no inflection, which was its own kind of inflection. "No questions about guests, no access to the East Wing, no unauthorized communication with anyone outside the compound. Meals at precisely the times on the schedule, not 5 minutes before, not 5 minutes after. Flavors clean and simple. Nothing elaborate, nothing that demands to be noticed." She paused. "The chairman does not eat for pleasure. He eats to continue. Previous staff, who believed they could change that, did not last the week." "What happened to the last chef?" Jasmine asked. Mrs. Lim looked at her for a long moment. "He forgot his place," she said. "And then he was gone, and those are the only 2 facts about him that matter." She left. Jasmine stood alone in the kitchen and made herself a very specific, very quiet promise. 6 months, clean work, no complications, Amara's tuition paid, her sister across the finish line, and then Jasmine would claw her way back into a legitimate kitchen and rebuild everything that Dalton Reed had burned to ash. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It was the kind of plan that made complete sense to a woman who had not yet met Kang Jiho and had no idea what was about to walk through that kitchen door. He came in at 7:45 and made no sound at all. That was the first thing that unsettled her. A man built the way Jiho was built, broad through the shoulder, over 6 feet, the kind of density that suggests a person has never once needed to compress themselves to fit into a space, should not have been able to move like silence. But he was standing in the kitchen doorway before she heard him, and when she looked up from the plate she was composing, the face that looked back at her was not what she expected from a man described as the most feared employer in the city. It was younger than she had pictured. Harder. A jaw set with the finality of a judge who had heard every argument and was no longer interested in new ones. Eyes so dark they seemed to consume the kitchen light rather than catch it. He was looking at her with the still, assessing intensity of a man who was accustomed to knowing exactly what everything in a room was worth. She looked back down at the plate. "Dinner is in 4 minutes," she said. "If you hover, it gets cold." Absolute silence from the doorway. Then, a long moment later, the sound of the dining room chair being pulled out. Mrs. Lim found Jasmine before breakfast the next morning. Her face was arranged in its standard expression of professional neutrality, but something underneath it was working very hard. "The chairman," she said, "ate everything on the plate." A pause. "All of it." Another pause. Longer. "He has not done that in 8 months. He has also not sat at the dining table in 8 months. She looked at Jasmine with an expression that was almost accusatory. "Whatever you put in that food, do it again tonight." Jasmine nodded and began morning prep and did not say that she hadn't put anything unusual in the food. That she had simply cooked it, like she meant it. That her mother had told her at age 9 that if you cook like you mean it, you will always be all right, and she had believed it every single day of her life since, even the days it had been very hard to believe anything at all. She found the notebook in the second week, second drawer of the kitchen island, behind a box of pastry weights. Soft-covered, worn to nothing at the corners, every page dense with Korean script in handwriting that had character, enthusiastic margins, small hand-drawn diagrams of plating arrangements, recipe notes that argued with themselves in the margins as though the writer had been in a running debate with the dish about what it wanted to become. It was the handwriting of someone who cooked the way Jasmine cooked, someone who thought a meal was a conversation. She stood at the island and turned pages, slowly, reading what she could cross-reference with her training, and by the 3rd page she had identified the dish. A deep, slow, bone broth stew. The kind that could not be rushed. The kind that required you to give it your time and your patience, and trust that it knew what it was doing. She put the notebook back exactly where she had found it. She closed the drawer. She stood at the counter for a moment, thinking about the handwriting, and the way it felt like someone's personality pressed into paper, and then she turned back to the day's prep and said nothing to anyone. That evening, she made the stew. She didn't plan it. She told herself later that she hadn't planned it, that her hands had simply known what they were doing while her mind was occupied elsewhere, which was true in the way that things are true when you know the real reason, but aren't ready to examine it. She made the stew from memory and instinct and the small details she had pulled from the notebook's margins. And she was still at the stove when the atmosphere in the kitchen changed, and she knew, without turning, that he had come in. She kept her eyes on the pot. "Someone who loved food wrote that recipe," she said. "I thought it deserved to be made." Nothing from behind her. She ladled the stew into a bowl and set it on the counter and went back to the prep surfaces and gave him the privacy of it, because she understood, without being told, that whatever the notebook meant to him, it was not a small thing, and he did not need her watching him while he dealt with it. When she finally looked over, the bowl was empty. His hands were flat on the table. He was completely still in the way that people are still when something large is moving through them and they are waiting for it to pass. "Who are you?" he said, not coldly, with the genuine bewilderment of a man whose categories had just turned out to be insufficient. "Your chef," Jasmine said. "Good night, Mr. Kang." She turned off the lights and walked out of the kitchen and went to bed and did not think at all about the look on his face when he had walked in and smelled the broth. She did not think about it once. She was very firm about that. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Yuna had placed a household informant 6 days before Jasmine arrived. What she did not know was that every meal, every exchange in the hallway, every evening at the stove was being reported in precise detail to a woman who had spent 3 years engineering herself into position and was not about to let a blacklisted chef from Lagos become a complication. What she did not know was that the war had already started and she hadn't been told she was in it. She found out on a Thursday. Yuna arrived in a car that cost more than the entire block Jasmine had grown up on. She moved through the compound the way certain women move through spaces they have already decided belong to them, not hurrying, not looking around, because looking around implies uncertainty, and Yuna had not been uncertain since she was 19 years old, and her father had told her that the Kang alliance would be hers to manage, and she had said yes, and meant it in every possible direction. She was extraordinary. Jasmine registered this without feeling threatened by it, the same way you register the weather. As information, not as a verdict on yourself. Yuna was tall, composed, dressed in a silk the color of smoke, and she wore her beauty like a credential. Her eyes moved over the compound with the precision of someone appraising what they already own. At dinner, she was impeccable. Conversation measured and intelligent. Posture, a statement. Every sentence placed on the table like a card in a hand being played with absolute confidence. She spoke to Jiho with the fluent ease of a woman who had rehearsed this dynamic so many times, it had become second nature, and Jiho responded in the clipped, obligatory register of a man who knew exactly what the performance was and had agreed to perform it, and was performing it now and thinking about something else entirely. He looked at the kitchen door twice during the meal. Jasmine noticed. She was pretty sure Yuna noticed too. Jasmine entered to clear the third course. She felt Yuna's eyes move to her the moment she came through the door. A single clean sweep of assessment, head to feet and back again, that lasted less than 2 seconds and reached a complete verdict. Jasmine kept her face professional and neutral, and cleared the plates and left, and went back to the kitchen, and stood at the sink, and breathed through her nose for a moment, before beginning the dessert. After the guests had gone, and the dining room had been cleared, and Mrs. Lim had retired, and the compound had settled into its late-night quiet, Jasmine was alone at the kitchen sink, finishing the last of the washing when the door opened. Yuna came in, still wearing every diamond she had arrived in. Her dinner smile was in place, but it had changed character. It was a blade now with very thin sheathing. She came to stand at the kitchen island with the casual ownership of a woman who had already decided this room was hers. And she looked at Jasmine, the way you look at a beautiful vase in a house you're buying, with appreciation that has nothing warm in it. "You cook beautifully," Yuna said. Her voice was pleasant. Completely pleasant. "I've rarely had food that good in a private home. It's a real talent." "Thank you," Jasmine said. She did not turn from the sink. "Where did you train?" Jasmine named the culinary school. Yuna made a small sound of polite recognition. "And before here?" Yuna asked. "Where were you working?" Jasmine paused for one beat, one single beat, and then said the name of her last legitimate placement, the one before Dalton Reed, because she was not going to stand in this woman's kitchen and apologize for her own history. Yuna was quiet for a moment. Then, "I hope this position has been good for you. The compound can be a difficult place to settle into. The chairman's household has very specific needs." Another pause, shorter. "I hope you understand that beautiful things in this house are replaceable, The kitchen went completely silent. Jasmine set down the pan she was washing. She turned around. She looked at Yuna with the full, level, unblinking composure of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being underpaid and overlooked and under-threatened, and had decided somewhere in her early 20s that she was simply finished being moved by any of it. She did not raise her voice. She did not change expression. She simply looked and let the silence do what silence does to people who are waiting to see if their words have landed. "Is there something you need from the kitchen, Ms. Shim?" she said. Yuna held her eyes for 3 seconds. The smile stayed on, but something shifted in it, a very slight recalculation. Then she said, pleasantly, "No, thank you for dinner," and she turned and walked out, and the door swung closed behind her. Jasmine turned back to the sink. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was tight. She breathed through it slowly, the way her mother had taught her, long enough to let the anger settle into something she could use, rather than something that would use her. She did not know that Jiho had come down the back corridor during the dessert and had been standing at the far end of the kitchen hallway and had heard every single word. She found out the following morning. Mrs. Lim appeared at the kitchen door before the first coffee was brewed and said, in the tone she used for significant information, delivered as administrative fact, "The chairman has revised the household reporting structure. Effective this morning, you report directly to him. Not to guests, not to visiting family members, not to anyone claiming authority in this compound who is not the chairman himself." She paused. "Directly to him." Jasmine looked at her. "Why?" Mrs. Lim's expression did not change. "I was not asked to explain the why," she said. "Only to deliver the what." She looked at Jasmine for a moment that held considerably more information than her words had. Make his breakfast. Yuna found out by noon. The temperature of the entire compound dropped 4 degrees. But that was not what broke things open. What broke things open was Dalton Reed, who reappeared 2 weeks later like a bad debt, and Jasmine's stubborn, bone-deep, lifelong insistence on handling everything alone. The message came through the estate's external communications portal at 6:47 in the morning, professionally worded and cheerfully lethal. Dalton Reed had located her through the recruitment agency. He had, he claimed, documentation supporting his original theft allegation, documentation that the Obsidian Group's board of directors would find highly relevant to their decision to employ her in a private household capacity. He was offering her the opportunity to resolve the matter before he was forced to escalate. The amount he named was 4 months of her current salary. He gave her 48 hours to respond. Jasmine read it again. Then she sat down at the small desk in her staff room with a legal pad and a pen, and began writing down every option she had, and the list was short enough to be demoralizing but long enough to confirm that she had something to work with. She had a former colleague who owed her a professional favor. She knew of a pro bono legal advisory service that handled employment blacklisting cases. She had documentation of her own, performance reviews, client feedback, email records from the 2 years she had worked for Dalton Reed that told a story considerably different from his version of events. She did not tell Jiho. She told herself this was because it was her problem, her history, her mess. She had been cleaning up other people's crises since she was 17 years old, and she had never once asked someone else to hold the broom, and she was not about to start now. She told herself that too, and it was also true. But underneath both of those truths was a third one she didn't examine too closely. That telling Jiho meant letting him into the edges of a life she was still fighting to keep her own. That a man who could erase a problem with a phone call was a man whose help came with gravity, and she wasn't sure yet what orbit she was willing to be pulled into. She worked on the legal angle for 2 days, made calls on her day off from a bench outside the compound, drafted a counter-response she was proud of, felt, cautiously, like she might be able to navigate this cleanly and quietly. On the morning of the 3rd day, she walked into the kitchen, and Jiho was already there. He was sitting at the island, not eating, not working, just sitting, with both hands flat on the counter and the printed message in front of him, and an expression that was the most frightening version of still she had seen on his face yet. The stillness of a man who had already decided what was going to happen, and was waiting for the formality of the conversation to catch up to the decision. "Sit down," he said. "I'm handling it," Jasmine said. "Sit down, Jasmine." She sat down, not because he told her to, because the alternative was standing over him and she needed to be level for this conversation. "You were going to manage this alone," he said. It was not a question. "I was managing it. With a former colleague and a charity legal service in 48 hours. He looked at her. "Against a man with 12 franchises and a monthly legal retainer. I've faced worse odds with less." "I know you have." His voice was very quiet. "That's not the point." He looked at the message for a moment and then back at her. "This man is using his proximity to my household as leverage against you. That makes it my concern whether you want it to be or not. I am not your employee's problem to manage." "You are not a problem," he said, and something shifted in his voice. Not loud, not dramatic, but a crack running through the glacier that she felt more than heard. "That is precisely the point. You are not a problem. He is, and I am going to correct him." He picked up his phone. He made one call. He said 4 sentences. He hung up. He looked at her. "It's done." Jasmine stared at him. "You don't even know what I had already built to fight him with." "Then tell me," Jiho said. "I'd like to know." She told him. Every document, every record, every carefully assembled piece of counter-evidence. She told him the whole of it, because he had asked and he was listening with the complete, focused attention of a person who was actually hearing and not simply waiting for his turn to speak. And it had been a long time since anyone had listened to her like that. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You would have won," he said. "I know. It would have taken 6 months and considerable cost and significant stress on top of everything else you're already carrying. I know that too." This way it took 4 minutes. She looked at him. She wanted to be angry about it. She was a little angry about it. She was also exhausted from 3 weeks of carrying the Dalton problem on top of everything else. And underneath the anger was the specific, aching relief of having set something down that had been heavy. She didn't say any of that. She said, "Don't do that again without telling me first." "Agreed," Jiho said, without hesitation. She blinked. She had been prepared for an argument, and he had simply agreed, which was somehow more disarming than anything else he could have done. She stood up and went to the stove and started breakfast, and he went back to whatever he had been doing before, and neither of them said anything else. But something had shifted, something small and structural, like a single stone moving in a wall, which by itself means nothing, but is always where the changes begin. That should have been enough of a warning. She should have recognized the specific quality of the danger she was in, not the compound, not the syndicate, not the enemies she didn't know she was accumulating yet. The quieter, more permanent kind of danger. The kind that doesn't threaten your life. The kind that rearranges it entirely. She didn't recognize it, or she recognized it and refused to name it, which in her experience amounted to the same thing. She was still refusing to name it 3 weeks later when everything collapsed at once. If you are watching this and you have ever refused to name something because naming it made it real, drop a comment right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it before the next part, because the next part is where this story gets truly ugly and truly beautiful at the same time, and you will want to have been here from the start. The storm arrived on a Tuesday night, and Jiho arrived with it. Jasmine heard the front door at 11:15, then silence for 20 minutes. Then, from the direction of the terrace, the sound of a chair being dragged and a bottle being set down on stone, which was a sound that had no business coming from a man who controlled an empire of glass and blood, and did it all from behind a face that had never once, in 6 weeks, allowed her to see what was happening underneath. She went back to sleep. Or she tried. She lay in the dark, listening to the rain lash the windows, and thought about Amara, who had called that afternoon sounding genuinely bright for the first time in months, and she thought about the tuition deadline that was now only 8 days away, and the fact that her next paycheck would cover exactly half of it, and she had no plan yet for the other half. She thought about the notebook in the kitchen drawer, and the handwriting that felt like a person she would have liked, and she thought about the way Jiho had said Seo's name the one time he had said it to her, like putting something made of glass down on a surface he wasn't sure would hold it. She got up at 11:53 and went to the terrace. Jiho was in the armchair with his jacket gone and his tie loosened and a glass of whiskey he was not quite finishing but was not setting down either. He was staring at the rain with the expression of a man who had been sitting with something unbearable for so long that the unbearable had become simply the texture of his evenings. He heard her come in but didn't turn. "You should be in bed," he said. "So should you," she said. She sat down across from him in the other chair without asking permission, and he did not tell her to leave, which was its own kind of answer. The rain crashed against the glass. The room was lit only by the faint ambient glow from the compound's exterior lights, and in it, Jiho looked less like the chairman of anything, and more like a man who was very tired in a way that sleep did not touch. "How long have you been sitting here?" she asked. "Since I got back." "Where were you?" A long pause. "Handling something." "Does handling something always look like this afterward?" He turned to look at her for the first time. His eyes were unguarded in a way she had never seen. No glacier, no verdict, no precision. Just the raw, undefended face of a human being who had run out of the energy to maintain the performance. It was the most honest he had ever looked, and it frightened her more than the controlled version, because the controlled version she knew how to navigate, and this one she did not. "Do you know why I eat alone?" he said. She didn't answer. "Because Seo was the one who made meals into something." He looked back at the rain. He was the only person in this compound who ever demanded that we sit down at the same table at the same time and eat like people, and not like animals working through a fuel problem. He had this theory that you could tell everything about a person by how they ate, whether they rushed, whether they tasted, whether they were present, or somewhere else. A pause. He said I ate like a man running from something. He said it every single meal we had together. He said it until I started eating slower just to prove him wrong. His jaw tightened. And then he died. And I stopped eating entirely, and I realized he had been right about everything. And it was too late to tell him. Jasmine didn't say she was sorry. She had always found that phrase well-meaning and almost entirely useless in the presence of real grief. Instead, she said, "Tell me what he was like." Jiho looked at her. "Tell me about him," she said, "not what happened to him, what he was like." The silence stretched out and she thought he was going to deflect, to put the controlled mask back on and redirect the conversation into something manageable, because that was what he did with everything that threatened to be real. But instead, he leaned back in the chair and he started talking, and once he started, he didn't stop for a long time. He told her about Seo stealing food from the kitchen at 2 a.m. and leaving elaborate notes of apology. He told her about Seo dragging him to a food market on the other side of the city every Saturday morning, because Seo believed that the best ingredients were the ones people sold from actual hands. He told her about the argument they had had the week before Seo died. Something stupid, something about a business decision Jiho had made unilaterally, and Seo had opposed, and the fact that they had not resolved it, and the way Jiho had been sitting with that unresolved argument for 18 months, like a stone behind his sternum that he could not dislodge. Jasmine listened. She did not fill the spaces. She did not make sounds of sympathy or rush to offer comfort. She simply sat across from him in the dark and let him talk, and she watched the weight of it moving across his face as he gave it language for the first time, and she understood that this was what the kitchen had been about from the beginning. Not the food, the hunger underneath the hunger, the thing that no amount of billion-dollar architecture could feed. When he finally stopped talking, the room was very quiet. "I played games with my keys," he said. "In the early weeks, I manufactured reasons to bring you to the office. I told myself it was curiosity, professional assessment. He looked at her directly. I have not been in control of a single thing in this building since the night you told me dinner was getting cold. You were insufferable, she said softly. I know. You had me searching your office on my hands and knees for keys you had thrown behind a bookshelf. I know that too. That was deeply undignified. Yes. A pause. I am sorry for that. She looked at him. The Ice King of Silverstone City, in the dark, on a stormy Tuesday, apologizing for hiding his car keys. She felt the last of her defenses make a sound like ice cracking in spring, and she decided that she was tired of defending against something that had already gotten through. She crossed the room. She sat on the edge of the low table in front of him, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and she looked at him at eye level, no distance between them, and she said, You are not the person I expected when I signed that contract. What did you expect? A man who owned things and called it living. And what did you find? She looked at his face, the grief still moving through it, the walls still half down, the person underneath more complicated and more real than any version she had prepared for. Someone who lost the only person who made him sit still long enough to eat, she said, and has been standing up ever since. Something broke open in his expression, not dramatically, quietly, the way things that have been held too tight for too long finally give, not with a crack, but with a slow, irreversible release. He reached up and took her hand from where it rested on her knee, and he held it in both of his with a carefulness that had nothing in it of the chairman or the Mafia boss or the Ice King. Just a man holding something he was afraid of losing before he had fully understood he had found it. Jasmine, he said. I know, she said. And the storm continued, and the compound went dark and quiet around them, and what happened next was not a transaction, or a strategy, or anything that lived in the world of empires, and syndicates, and carefully drafted arrangements. It was two people who had been running in the dark for entirely different reasons, arriving, finally, in the same room, and choosing, with the full weight of everything they both knew it meant, to stop. What neither of them knew was that Yuna Shim's informant had been in the East Corridor, had heard every word, had sent a message before the storm had finished. 3 weeks after the storm, Jasmine stood in a pharmacy bathroom 30 minutes from the compound with a test in her hand and the particular quality of silence that descends when your entire future reorganizes itself around a single fact. She read the result, read it again, sat on the edge of the small plastic chair in the corner, and looked at the water-stained ceiling tile above her head for what was probably 4 minutes and felt like considerably longer. She was not shocked. She was not naive. She understood, precisely, and without flinching, how she had arrived at this moment, and she had no regrets about any of it. Not the storm, not the conversation, not the hand held in the dark, not any of it. What she had, instead of regret, was a very clear and very cold understanding of the situation she was now navigating. Jiho ran a criminal empire in a city full of men, who were waiting for the smallest crack in his armor. She was a blacklisted chef with a sister in medical school, and no family money, and no name that meant anything in his world. And she was carrying his child in a compound where at least one person on staff had already demonstrated they were reporting her movements to a woman who had called her replaceable while wearing diamonds that cost more than Jasmine's annual salary. She needed to think. She needed time to find the right words. She needed a plan that was honest and careful, and gave both of them the dignity of a real conversation. She gave herself 5 days. She got 48 hours. Yuna's informant had intercepted a pharmacy delivery confirmation. Jasmine had paid cash for the test, but the follow-up prescription the clinic had called in had been routed through the compound's external address from her onboarding file. One thread, thin as a hair. But Yuna had built her entire position in this city on the knowledge that thin threads, pulled correctly, could bring down anything. She confirmed the pregnancy through a personal contact at the clinic, cost her one favor and 20 minutes. She had the information within a day of Jasmine having it. She sat with it in her private suite in the East Wing, the suite Jiho had given her the use of during the engagement arrangement, the suite she had never quite vacated because leaving would have been a concession, and she turned the information over in her hands and examined it from every angle with the calm, thorough methodology of a woman who had been playing this game since before Jasmine had arrived in the city. The pregnancy was a problem, but a pregnancy, handled correctly, was also a weapon. She made 3 calls. The first to her father, brief and informational. The second, to her family's legal team. The third, to a man named Harlan Voss, who led the Voss syndicate and had been waiting 18 months for a weakness in Kang Jiho's operation with the patient. Unhurried confidence of a man who believed that every fortress eventually showed a crack if you simply waited long enough and watched carefully enough. She gave Harlan Voss the crack with both hands. The woman's name, the pregnancy, the compound location and supply schedule. The specific, devastating detail that the woman carrying the Kang heir was a person with no protection, no family money, no syndicate backing, and no idea that anything was coming. He will have to choose, Yuna told Harlan, the empire or the liability. I know which one he'll choose. I have spent 3 years studying this man. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. The men who stopped Jasmine on the supply road 2 mornings later were not loud. That was the worst of it. They were quiet and well-dressed, and they delivered their message with the flat, procedural calm of people reading from a script that had been approved at a senior level. 2 of them, standing at the road junction where the compound supply vehicle slowed to turn, as though they had been there a while, as though they had known exactly when she would come. Ms. Okonkwo, the taller one said, we have a message for the chairman. Jasmine went very still. She made herself look at them, both of them, memorizing faces. The chairman has until Friday, the man said, to surrender his claim on the Northern Territories to the Voss Syndicate. If he refuses, or fails to respond, the woman and whatever she is carrying will not make it to the following week. He said it without heat, without pleasure, which was worse than either because it meant the calculation had been made at a distance, cleanly, by someone who would never have to stand here and say these words and look at the face of the person receiving them. Do you understand the message? I understand it, Jasmine said. Her voice was level. She was extraordinary at level when everything else was falling. Good. He stepped back. Have a safe morning. They walked away. She watched them until they were gone. Then she stood at the road junction in the early morning cold for 63 seconds. She counted them, because counting was something to do with her mind while her body remembered how to breathe. And then she turned and walked back to the compound. Her legs were steady. Her hands were not. She pressed them flat against her thighs as she walked, and she thought about Amara, who was 8 days from the end of her final semester and had no idea her sister was walking back to a Mafia compound carrying a threat on her life and a pregnancy she hadn't disclosed yet. She thought about her mother's knife in the block on the kitchen counter and the philosophy that had come with it. She thought about the 17 years she had spent being the wall between everyone she loved and everything that wanted to knock it down, and she thought, not today. Not this. This one as she was not carrying alone. She walked, through the front gate, through the main corridor, past Mrs. Lim, who looked up from the desk and saw her face and stood without a word. Past the kitchen she did not stop in, all the way to the east wing and the war room door at the end of it. She knocked once. She opened the door. 8 men stood around Jiho's desk. Serious men with serious faces in a room that smelled of strategy and controlled urgency. All 8 looked up. 7 of them saw an intrusion. Jiho saw her face, and the room ceased to exist for him. "Out," he said. 8 men left in 10 seconds. The door closed. The silence that followed was complete. Jiho came around the desk slowly. He didn't rush. He moved with the controlled deliberateness of a man making himself not run, because running would frighten her more than stillness, and she recognized the consideration in it, and loved him for it in a way she was not prepared to examine at this particular moment. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face and waited. She told him about the pregnancy first. She had made this decision on the walk back. He deserved to hear it from her, in her words, before it became entangled in everything else. She watched his face as she said it. Watched the stillness deepen. Watched something move through his eyes that she had no single word for. Something that was fear and relief and the specific shattering quality of receiving news that reorders everything you thought you understood about what you wanted. He did not speak for a long moment. "How long have you known?" he said. 3 days. A silence that had weight. "You were going to tell me." "Yes. When I was ready. When I had found the right way. And then someone took that from me," she said. "So I'm telling you now. Like this. I'm sorry it's like this." He looked at her for a moment that felt very long, and then he said, simply, "Don't apologize. And then, tell me the rest." She told him about the road, the men, the message, the Friday deadline and the Northern Territories, and the name Harlan Voss, which she had heard once, in a compound conversation, through a wall that wasn't quite thick enough. She told him all of it standing in the center of his war room, with her hands pressed against her thighs, and she watched his face go through something she could only describe as a controlled detonation. Every layer of the professional mask dissolving one by one, until what was underneath was not the Ice King and not the Mafia boss, but the man from the storm, undefended and entirely present. When she finished, he turned to the window. She watched his shoulders. She had learned, in the weeks of cooking for him, and around him, and occasionally at him, to read the specific languages of his body, the way tension lived in the line of his spine, the way his stillness had different qualities for different kinds of feeling. This stillness was not cold. It was tectonic. The stillness of something very large, deciding how much force to apply. "How long have you known about the pregnancy?" he said again. 3 days. She paused. "I was going to tell you Friday." "They knew before I did." "Yes." He turned. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, and she steeled herself for calculation, for the strategic assessment of a man processing a threat, for the Ice King running numbers. Instead, he reached out and put both hands on her face, gently, with the enormous, careful gentleness of a man who had just understood that something irreplaceable was standing in front of him. And he looked at her with complete, undisguised, unmanaged honesty. "They will not touch you," he said. "I need you to believe that, not as a promise from the chairman. From me." Jasmine looked at him. "I believe you," she said. "Now go deal with it." Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. He pressed his forehead to hers for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stepped back and the Ice King came. Back on, and he picked up his phone, and the war began. What happened in the next 48 hours? Jasmine watched from the kitchen, and the edges of corridors, and the small charged silences between 1 hour and the next. Men arrived in cars with no plates and left in different cars. Jiho was on his phone in the war room for stretches that ran through meals he did not come out for, and Jasmine left trays outside the door and they disappeared and came back empty, which was the only evidence she had that he was still functioning as a biological entity. Mrs. Lim moved through the compound with a sharpened battle station efficiency, issuing instructions in low, rapid Korean to staff who moved like people who understood that the building they were standing in had shifted into a different mode. The names that moved through walls, Voss, Harlan, the northern routes, a courier network, a clinic record, Each one landed in Jasmine's ear like a piece of a picture assembling itself into a shape she had already drawn in her head. She had drawn it weeks ago. She had looked at Yuna in this kitchen and heard the words, "Beautiful things in this house are replaceable," and filed them in the folder she kept for people who showed you their intentions clearly enough that it would be your own fault later if you were surprised. She was not surprised. She cooked. She cooked the way she always cooked when things were falling, with everything she had, with complete attention, because the kitchen had always been the room where she could be entirely present and entirely herself, and neither of those things was negotiable. She made good food for a compound full of people running a controlled crisis, and she left it on the pass, and it got eaten, and that was enough. That was her part of this. On the second evening, Jiho came into the kitchen at 9:15, looking like a man who had just concluded a war. Jacket off, sleeves rolled, the particular exhaustion of someone who had been operating on adrenaline and strategy for 2 days and had reached the end of both. He sat down at the kitchen island, and she put a plate in front of him without being asked, and he ate half of it before he spoke. "Voss has been addressed," he said. "I know," Jasmine said. "I could hear the addressing from the kitchen." He looked up. Something in his face relaxed by a fraction. "The men who stopped you on the road have been located and removed from any future capacity to stop anyone on any road." Removed meaning they are no longer a consideration. She decided not to push that thread. And Voss himself has been made to understand that the Northern Territories are not, and have never been, a transaction he was qualified to propose. Jiho set his fork down and looked at her directly. "I also know how he received the information. I have known since approximately 4 hours after you walked into my war room. I waited for full documentation before acting. Because I needed it to be airtight." Jasmine looked at him. The single word was already in her chest before she said it. "Yuna." "Yes." The silence that followed was the kind that histories are made of. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the absolute, irrevocable weight of a thing being confirmed that you already knew and had hoped, in some buried part of yourself, was wrong. "She gave him the pregnancy," Jasmine said. "Not just my location, the pregnancy." "Yes. She gave a rival syndicate your unborn child as operational intelligence." "Yes." His voice was the quiet that preceded the end of things. "She did." Jasmine set down the cloth she had been holding. She sat down across from him. She looked at the man who had built 15 years of criminal architecture and was currently sitting in his kitchen at 9 in the evening eating food she had made, and looking at her with the specific undone expression of a man whose definition of unacceptable had just been tested in a way that had clarified everything. "What are you going to do?" she said. "What I should have done 3 years ago," Jiho said. "End it. Formally, finally, and with enough settlement that there is nothing left to contest." He paused. "The Shim alliance will fracture. There will be political fallout across 4 territories and 3 syndicate agreements. It will be expensive and complicated, and it will take time to stabilize." He looked at her. "I will handle it. Jiho." She reached across the island and put her hand over his. "I'm not asking if you can handle it. I know you can handle it. I'm asking if you're all right." He looked at her hand on his. He turned his palm up and held it. His grip was tight in the way that people grip things they are afraid of losing, and she let him hold on. "No," he said, honestly. "But I will be." Yuna was summoned the following afternoon. She arrived in the council chamber with the composure of a professional. Dark dress, no jewelry except the ring, which Jasmine noted from the doorway, Jiho had left open, deliberately open, so that she could witness what came next. Yuna sat with the posture of a woman who had prepared for multiple versions of this conversation, and was confident she could navigate whichever one presented itself. She had been preparing for negotiations her entire adult life. She looked at the documents already laid out on the table, and she looked at Jiho standing rather than sitting, and she recalibrated her confidence by a percentage that was still not nearly enough. She read the documents. She took her time. Her fingers went still on the third page and stayed still for 5 seconds, the only external sign that the ground had shifted. And then she looked up, and her face was composed, and her voice was composed, and she said, "You know what I was protecting?" "Tell me," Jiho said. He wanted to hear her say it. "The alliance, your position, the political structure that keeps this empire standing, she is..." Yuna paused, choosing the word with precision. "A liability. She is a woman with no name in your world, no family behind her, no syndicate, no leverage. She walked into this compound with a culinary certificate and a false theft allegation following her and nothing else. And the moment your enemies found out she existed, she became a target. I did not create that vulnerability. She did, simply by being here. Simply by being who she is." The room was very quiet. "Simply by being who she is," Jiho repeated. "Yes. A woman who sat with me in the dark and asked me to talk about my brother. A woman who made Seo's stew because she found his notebook and thought it deserved to be made. A woman who walked into my war room with threats on her life and her hands shaking and her voice completely steady because she wanted me to hear the pregnancy from her before she told me anything else." He looked at Yuna with the absolute, final clarity of a man who had nothing left to weigh. "That is who she is. And you used her and our child as currency in a negotiation with a man who wanted to destroy everything I have spent my life building." His voice did not rise. "There is no contract, no family arrangement, no political architecture in any world that survives that decision. We are done. You will receive a settlement that is generous beyond anything you deserve. You will leave today." Yuna's composure cracked. Not the whole of it. She was too accomplished for that. But a seam opened, and what showed through was not grief, and was not love, and was not even the cold, strategic fury Jasmine had expected. It was something older and rawer. The genuine, incredulous rage of a woman who had played every move correctly and still lost, because the other player had changed the game entirely. "For her," Yuna said, low and precise as a blade, "you are burning 15 years for a woman who was cleaning floors 2 months ago. A woman your enemies will target for the rest of her life simply for standing next to you. You think that's love? You think that's a future? You are handing your enemies a weapon they will never stop using. Then I will spend the rest of my life making sure they never reach her," Jiho said. "That is not a burden. That is a reason." Yuna looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him to the doorway where Jasmine stood. The look was long and direct and entirely without the social veneer. Just Yuna Shim, genuinely, looking at the woman who had walked into a compound and dismantled something she had spent years constructing. It was not a kind look, but it was honest. And in the honesty, there was something that was almost, not quite, but almost recognition. She removed the ring, placed it on the table, walked out. Jiho did not watch her go. He was already looking at Jasmine. The Shim alliance fractured within the week, exactly as predicted. The political fallout was significant, complicated, and handled. Jasmine heard it happening in the background, the way you hear distant weather, real, consequential, and taking place in a part of the sky that was not currently above her head. She cooked through it, and on the night the last negotiation concluded, she found him in the kitchen. He was at the stove, sleeves rolled to the elbow, jacket on the back of a chair, Seo's notebook open on the counter beside him, with his own handwriting appearing in the margins now. Questions, corrections, second and third attempts in a hand that was learning. The kitchen smelled of ginger and bone broth and the deep, slow warmth of a meal that was trying to become what it needed to be. And Jasmine stood in the doorway and watched him for a full minute before he heard her. He was losing the argument with the pot. She could tell by the way he tasted the broth, frowned, reached for the ginger, reconsidered, put it back, picked up the ladle again. The precise and controlled man trying to do something that required patience over force, and finding that no amount of training in the other thing prepared you for this one. It was one of the most human things she had ever watched him do, and it cost her considerably to stand in the doorway and let him struggle with it, rather than simply walking over and fixing it immediately. She gave him 40 seconds. Then she walked in. She took the spoon from his hand without asking. He let her take it without resistance, which was its own significant thing. She tasted the broth, adjusted the heat to medium-low, removed a piece of ginger he had left too long, added a single strip of dried kelp from the shelf above the stove that he had been standing directly in front of without seeing. She put the lid on. She stepped back. "It needs 40 minutes from here," she said. "You cannot rush collagen. It will give you exactly what it has to give and not one thing more, and if you push it, you will have hot water with ambitions instead of a broth." Jiho looked at the pot, then at her. "I've been standing here for an hour." "I know. I could tell from the broth." "That's irritating." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." He leaned back against the counter and looked at her with the directness she had gotten used to. The full attention look that had been unnerving 6 weeks ago and was something else now. Grounding, precise. The look of a person who was entirely present with you and had made a decision about it. "I owe you an apology," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "For the keys," he said, "and for the window cleaning, and for the 3 occasions I called you back to the office on pretexts that were not, in retrospect, even remotely convincing." A pause. "And for monitoring your communications, which was standard protocol but which I should have been transparent about from the beginning." "That last one I'm still deciding about," she said. "Fair. The keys I've forgiven." "I know. You told me. I told you I was finished being angry about it. That's not the same as forgiveness." "What's the difference?" She looked at him. "Forgiveness means I've decided it doesn't count against you. Finished being angry means I got tired of carrying it." She crossed to the other side of the island and sat down on the stool across from him. "You get forgiveness when you stop doing the version of the same thing." "Which version am I still doing?" "The one where you handle things without telling me first. The Voss situation. I understand why you moved fast. I'm not criticizing the speed, but there were 48 hours where I was cooking in this kitchen, not knowing whether the situation was resolved or escalating, and you didn't tell me anything." He was quiet for a moment. "I was protecting you. I know you were. That is not in dispute." She looked at him steadily. "But I have been the person who held information about dangerous situations to protect the people around me for my entire life, Jiho. And I can tell you from experience that the person you're protecting does not feel protected. They feel managed." A pause. "I am not something to be managed." "No," he said. "You are not." He held her gaze. "I will do better. I know you will." They looked at each other across the kitchen island in the warm, ginger-scented air, and it was the most straightforward, honest, unglamorous exchange they had ever had, and it was worth more than the storm night and the stew and the hand held in the dark, because this was what came after all of that, the ordinary, necessary, unglamorous work of 2 people deciding to be in the same life, and doing it with their eyes open. "I am restructuring the syndicate," Jiho said. "Fully and permanently. The Northern Territories are gone. The Obsidian Group will be legitimate within 18 months. I have already briefed the board and structured the transition." He paused. "I am telling you this now, immediately, because you told me to stop managing information, and I am trying." Jasmine looked at him. She felt the smile before she could stop it. "That is the least romantic way anyone has ever delivered significant news." "I am not romantic." "You hid your car keys to manufacture reasons to be near me." "That was strategy." "Jiho, poorly executed strategy." She laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and warm, the kind that surprised her. He looked at it with the expression she had come to recognize, the specific, slightly undone look of a man who had been living in a very quiet house and had only recently remembered that houses were supposed to have sound in them. "The obsidian transition," she said when she had recovered. "What does that mean for the people who work for you in the other capacity?" "Generous settlement, legitimate employment offered where appropriate, clean exits otherwise." He paused. "It is not a simple process. It will take time, and it will require maintaining some of the old architecture in the short term, while the new structure is built. I won't pretend otherwise." "I'm not asking for pretend," Jasmine said. "I'm asking for honest." "Then honestly, it will be messy and complicated, and I will make decisions in the next 18 months that I won't be proud of, because that is the nature of dismantling something that was built on methods I'm no longer willing to use." He looked at her. "But it ends, fully, not for appearances, because I will not raise my children inside it." Jasmine was quiet for a moment. She thought of Amara, of her mother's kitchen, and the stool, and the philosophy she had been given at 9 years old, and had carried every day since. She thought of the 17 years of being the wall, and the specific, transformative quality of standing next to someone who had decided to be a wall too. She thought of the child, their child, and what it meant to build a life that was worth inheriting. "Amara's tuition," she said. She had been carrying the number in her chest for 3 days, counting down the deadline, running the math in every quiet moment. 8 days, one paycheck that covered half, a gap she did not yet have a plan for. Jiho said, "Has been settled." She stared at him. "I arranged it 3 days ago," he said, simply, without ceremony or expectation, the way he said everything that mattered. "She is going to be a doctor. That should exist in the world without qualification." Jasmine looked at the counter, at the notebook open between them, Seo's handwriting and Jiho's handwriting side by side in the margins of the same recipe. Two people in conversation with the same dish from different sides of the same grief. She looked at the steam lifting gently from the pot. She looked at her own hands, calloused and scarred and honest, the hands her mother had pressed the knife into, the hands that had fed this man back into the world of the living one, bowl at a time. She stood up. She walked around the island and she stopped in front of him and she put her hand flat against his chest, over his heartbeat, and she looked at him without performance or defense or any of the careful professional composure she had spent 6 weeks constructing. "SEO would have liked you," she said. "This version. The one standing in the kitchen at night getting beaten by a broth recipe. The one who settles a medical tuition like a footnote and thinks that's normal. The one who is choosing, out loud, to become something his children can look at." She held his gaze. "He would have liked you very much." Jiho went completely still. She felt his heartbeat under her palm, steady and real and present, and she watched something move across his face. That was not the crack in the glacier this time, but the glacier itself. The entire structure, finally and irrevocably, releasing. He put his hands on her face. Both of them, cupping it with a carefulness that was its own kind of statement. The statement of a man who had spent a long time not believing he deserved to touch anything gently and was choosing, right now, to try. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I have not been afraid of very much in my life. I have built an empire on the principle that fear is a liability, and I have operated accordingly. I have walked into rooms that made grown men turn around at the door. I have held my ground in situations that would have unmade most people." He held her face and looked at her with complete, unshielded honesty. "You terrify me. The specific you, the woman who told me dinner was getting cold on the first night. The woman who made my dead brother's recipe because she thought it deserved to exist. The woman who walked into my war room with her hands shaking and every single word in the right order." His thumbs moved gently against her cheekbones. "I am afraid," of the morning, you decide this is not worth the cost of it. I'm afraid of that, the way I have been afraid of almost nothing in 36 years of building. Things specifically, so I would never be afraid of anything. Jasmine looked at him for a long moment. She thought of all the things she could say, reassurances and promises, and the carefully measured language of a person managing expectations, all the tools she had spent a lifetime sharpening for exactly this kind of moment. She set all of them down. I'm not going anywhere, she said, but you will stop rushing this broth or I will not be responsible for what it becomes. He laughed, real and full and unguarded, the laugh she had been building toward for 6 weeks without knowing she was doing it. It filled the kitchen, and she felt it against her palm over his chest, and it was the best thing she had heard since the day Amara had called, sounding genuinely bright, and it cost her nothing to smile back at him. The broth needed 31 more minutes. They gave it 31 more minutes. They ate Seo's stew at the kitchen table when it was done, both of them, across from each other, in the warm kitchen of the compound, with the ocean outside, and the city at a distance, and nothing between them and the meal, except 2 bowls and 2 spoons, and the quiet that lives between people who have earned it. Jiho finished first. He set his spoon down, and looked at his empty bowl and said, quietly and without sentimentality, "He would have argued with you about the kelp." "He would have been wrong," Jasmine said. "Completely wrong," Jiho agreed. "He would not have accepted that. We would have had this argument every time." A pause. "He would have made us make it both ways and then staged a blind tasting. He would have invited Mrs. Lim and the entire kitchen staff and made everyone vote." "Who would have won?" Jiho looked at her. "You," he said. "He would have made sure of it." She looked at him across the table, the man the city feared, the man who had hidden his car keys like a teenager, the man who had talked about his brother in the dark and cried in exactly the way that people cry when they are finally giving something the weight it deserves. And she felt the full settled permanence of something that had moved from fragile to structural, without either of them quite noticing when the shift had happened. Outside, Silverstone City was exactly what it had always been. Dangerous and indifferent and full of men who were already recalculating the new geometry of power now that the Ice King had stepped back from the board. There would be more to navigate, rivals pushing at new edges, political structures taking time to stabilize, an 18-month transition that would require patience and compromise, and the kind of decisions that came with costs Jiho had already promised to pay honestly. None of it was finished. None of it was simple. But in the kitchen, the broth had been right. The heat had been correct. The man across the table had chosen, out loud and without reservation, to become someone worth the meal. And Jasmine Okonkwo, who had walked out of Dalton Reed's kitchen with her mother's knife and nothing else, and had ended up here, in the truest room in the most dangerous house in Silverstone, building something that would outlast every empire either of them had ever touched, had cooked like she meant it, which meant, as her mother had always promised, that she was going to be all right. Both of them were. If this story lived in your chest the way it was supposed to, subscribe right now, like this video, and drop your answer to this in the comments before you go anywhere. Yuna said Jasmine was a liability, a woman with no name, no status, no protection. She said Jiho was making a catastrophic mistake, but Jasmine walked out with everything, and Yuna walked out with a settlement check. So I need this community to tell me the truth. Was Yuna wrong about Jasmine? Or was she right, and Jasmine just got lucky? Because I think this comment section is going to be split completely down the middle, and I am here for every word of it. Drop it below. See you in the next one.